Okay. Psalms 2. Why do the nations rage, and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us.
I'd like to take a few minutes to look at Psalms 2. Not too long ago, we looked at Psalm 1, and I really learned a lot, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of these things way before I did, but I was looking at Psalm 2, and I thought I'd share a couple things I noticed. It's actually a passage that came in handy when the church first started. I'm going to end with that. It's kind of important to know what Psalm 2 is saying, because when the church first started, some of the first Christians used it at a pretty key moment. So that's where we're headed with this. So we just read, of course, we have various translations that might help us, like what Scott just read, why are the nations in an uproar? And the people's devising a vain thing. Some translations say, why do the heathens rage? Some of your translations will say that. It talks about the kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. But that phrase, why do the heathens rage? That's kind of the initial heart of this. And basically it's just saying, why do the nations attack God's anointed king when they're doomed to fail? Initially it was about David. It says, you're not going to beat David. He's unbeatable. When he was right with God, nothing could stop him. And so that's essentially what it's saying. So why do they even bother to try to take on the Lord's anointed when they know they're going to fail, or they should know? And it's helpful for us to look at this. We're not under the rulership of David, of course, but the Lord's anointed is in play right now with Jesus. And so the application is kind of a parallel. What you read about here as far as the Lord's anointed had to do with David, but even more so for us as Jesus is our king. And that word nations or heathen is basically anybody who's not following God. If somebody disconnects himself from God, it's a lose-lose situation. And to rage against the standards that God presents is a for sure decline and defeat. That word uproar in the first verse, why are the nations in an uproar or rage? That has to do with being tumultuous or out of control, chaotic. That essentially describes an ungodly life. They'll never have peace. It's just this stormy life trying to find some kind of direction and some kind of control. And this hostility toward God, you'll see the word against in verse 2. This hostility toward God, when I was reading this, I thought, okay, well, it's people who rise up and carry, poster boards and are anti-church and things like that. And it suddenly hit me, if you look at Romans 8, hostility towards God is actually a very short trip. It's not necessarily all about, I'm going to read Romans 8 here in a second, verse 7. It's not necessarily about a concerted effort to oppose him, to deny that he exists. According to Romans 8:7, it tells me the mind set on the flesh is hostile toward God. It even goes on to talk about how a mind set on the flesh is incapable of being right with God and understanding the truth. So this hostility, this raging against God is not necessarily an epic political movement. It can be a very individual effort of just living like the world. Back in Psalm 2, verse 3, it says that they're saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. The world looks at Christianity sometimes and thinks of it as a lack of freedom. This idea of the fetters, some of you may have different translations, but it's the idea of being tied down, restricted. And there's a lot of people, even who have been around the church, say, okay, I want to be free. I don't want all the rules and the regulation of my life. And so I'm going to go off and search for my freedom, which is a misconception of freedom. It's the freedom to lose. I don't know if you remember in Jeremiah, there's a verse where God says, okay, you want freedom? It's yours. You're free to die by the sword. You're free to have pestilence. That's the freedom that waits for anybody who breaks away from God. Verse 4, this is Psalm 2, verse 4. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. And the idea is that anything that would set out to oppose God, whether individually or even a nation or a world power, anything that thinks they could go against that is laughable. Every breath that a person takes is only by permission of God. I couldn't help but think we have a little dog. She's not a manly dog. When I take her walking, I don't get any masculine points at all. She's a little Chihuahua, full grown, pink collar. So there you go. And she is a little dog. But we kind of limit her outings when we want to relax and go for a walk as a family, because she thinks she can take on all the dogs she sees. I don't know if little dogs are just born with that insanity, but they think they can take on the big dogs. And I can't help but think every time she does that, in one of Charles Dickens's books, he's talking about a little dog trying to take on a big dog, and he says, and the big dog could have taken him like a pill. That's Effie's situation. It's laughable. There's no way you're gonna lose if you oppose God. That's the whole point of this. This is why do they bother? Why do the heathens rage? Why does the world resist this and try to rise up against what God has planned to set up a revolution on the very stage that he created? It's a laughable effort, is what he's saying. And then in verse 5, Psalm 2:5, then he will speak to them in his anger. Notice there was just laughing, almost ridicule. Now there's anger. And terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, and notice the wording here, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. And like we said, so initially he's talking about David, but of course now we're talking about our king. The church is described as in association with Zion, being prepared for heaven. He has installed the king. Zion is the highest hill in Jerusalem, and that's what he's saying. King David's in position, not going to touch him. Even more so with Jesus established as our king in the church. Verse 7, I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. And that word begotten doesn't mean that he became the son of God. He was announced. He was presented. You probably remember on more than one occasion where he verbally announced. He said, this is my son. At his baptism in Matthew 3 and Matthew 17 with the transfiguration. Here's verse 8 of Psalm 2. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance and the very ends of the earth as your possession. It's kind of like going to David, said, it's all yours. If you stick with me, nothing will be able to stand up to you. You'll be in charge of it all. Even more so with Jesus. Not going to be just in control of Israel. We're talking about someone in control of the whole world. Here's a couple of verses to remind us of that. Philippians 2:10. It's helpful to get the frail imagery that movies often present Jesus with. Philippians 2:10 says, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth. In other words, everybody. 1 Corinthians 10:26. For the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. There's many other verses that indicate, of course, Jesus was involved in creation. He is the King of Kings. Here's Psalm 2:9. And this you might have caught with your daily Bible reading. It's kind of a theme that kind of surfaces once in a while. You'll notice in Psalm 2:9 it says, you shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware. Jesus is often described as having this iron rod and smashing stuff with it. That everything that tries to go up against those forces are like pottery. That word rod is the same word that's used for a scepter. So it's not only the idea of the rod and staff of a shepherd, but it's the rod or scepter of a king, one and the same. And they smash stuff. That anything that would go up against it, especially when he's protecting his sheep. But of course it means power. We just read this in Revelation, so I thought I'd point it out to you. Revelation 2:26 in our daily Bible reading. We're coming up on the end of our daily Bible reading efforts. And in Revelation 2:26, you remember this. This is why this imagery is used here. A good example of how Revelation ties up so many threads in the Bible. Revelation 2:26. He who overcomes and he who keeps my deeds to the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of the potter are broken to pieces, as I also have received authority from my Father. And then if you jump to Revelation 19:15, same imagery. Revelation 19:15, this rod, this scepter, from his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, and he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God the Almighty. So when the Son of God is involved, everything else is as breakable as pottery. Here's back to Psalm 2, verse 10. So here's you might think of it this way. Here's fair warning. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Verse 11, worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he may not become angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. If you'd go over to Psalm 111, verse 10, I'm going to share just a few more verses to kind of maybe draw more attention to Psalm 2. Psalm 111, verse 10. Did you notice back in Psalm 2, he says, rejoice with trembling? It seems like an odd phrase. Rejoice with fear. But according to Psalm 111, verse 10, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding of all those who do his commandments, his praise endures forever. The fear of God, it's an odd thing. The fear of God leads to comfort. In fact, Isaiah 8 even says, he shall be your dread. It says, don't look anxiously about you. That's what Isaiah says. Don't be afraid of all that. Be afraid of God. And if you realize the power that you're dealing with standing next to him, you don't have anything else to be afraid of. That fear trumps all other fears. That fear leaves no room for all the things that can't ultimately touch us. This fear of God leads to comfort, because we know that same fearful power protects us. And that's why at the end of Psalm 2, he says, take refuge. See how powerful he is? See how laughable it is for the nations to try to go up against him? Stand close to him. You're going to be fine. So, if you go to the beginning of Acts 3, I'm going to skim Acts 3 and then read parts of Acts 4. I find this pretty interesting. The church has started. You know, of course, in Acts 2, 3,000 people were baptized. There's a big, big start to the church. It's established. It's strong. Shortly after that, Peter and John bump into this guy who's never walked before. This is the beginning of Acts 3. You probably remember reading about this. And Peter heals him. Remember, he says, we don't have any money for you, but I can do this. And he makes him walk again. And he had never walked before. And of course, everyone's amazed by this. And the purpose of the miracles, of course, was to establish authority for the teaching. And Peter does that. He says, why are you surprised? And he presents this lesson saying, essentially, the only reason I was able to heal this man is because Jesus is involved. When he's involved, big things happen. But he also points out, you pushed for his crucifixion, but he's been raised from the dead. So he kind of wraps up the lesson this way. So it's important that you change your behavior and accept his offer to rescue you. And that was the plan from the very beginning. You need to stop making bad choices, or you're going to be condemned and lost. That's essentially his lesson. Now, if you'll go to Acts 4, verse 1, here's what happens. So they heal this guy. He presents that basic lesson about redemption. Some people overhear this, Acts 4, 1, and they don't like it. As they were speaking to the people, the priests and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came up to them, being greatly disturbed because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection from the dead, and they laid hands on them and put them in jail until the next day, for it was already evening. But many of those who had heard the message believed, and the number of the men came to about 5,000. That's more than 3,000. Jewish leaders, they question Peter and John. They're not happy about how they're pointing to Jesus. Peter doesn't retract. Look at it in Acts 4:12. He tells it straight to them too. This is while they're questioning him. Acts 4:12. They're saying, hey, don't, hold Jesus up so much. This is what Peter says in Acts 4:12. There's salvation in no one else, for there's no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. So the leaders, it's kind of funny, they just say, well, just stop it. And they say, we can't just stop it. We're going to keep talking. And they say, we mean it. And then they release them. Here's Acts 4:23. So this is in the aftermath of this. You can almost picture them, out of breath or at least a little bit shook up of having been arrested. Here's Acts 4:23. When they had been released, they went to their own companions and reported all that the chief priests and the elders had said to them. And when they heard this, they lifted their voices to God with one accord and said, O Lord, it is you who made the heaven, the earth, and the sea, and all that is in them. And then Peter quotes Psalm 2, for whatever that's worth. Watch this. Acts 4:25. Who by the Holy Spirit, through the mouth of our father David, your servant, said, why did the Gentiles rage and the peoples devise futile things? The kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. And that's exactly what happened. The forces at hand took their stand and failed. Here's Acts 4:27. For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod, this is all the powers here, and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. So here it is. All kinds of powerful efforts to oppose the plan of God, but the plan is unstoppable. Then Peter presents a Christian response. So when we read Psalm 2, there should be a takeaway for us. Acts 4:29. Here's after he quotes Psalm 2. This is what he quotes at the end of Acts 4:29. And now, Lord, take note of their threats and grant that your bondservants may speak your word with all confidence. So here it is. They're arrested. He goes back, he quotes Psalm 2, which essentially says it's laughable to oppose us. And the response is, we can be confident about this. We're on the winning side. When we read Psalm 2, that's kind of the reminder for us. The world might rage against you, but the plan is unstoppable. And that gives us an appropriate confidence to stand by the truth and not waver, but with kindness and love, make sure that we stand up because we're part of the ultimate plan. Why do the heathens rage? They're going to lose. This is going to happen. I appreciate Joe picking this song. We're going to be singing that Jesus saves, and it's going to happen. It's really, really wise to stick to the plan and be confident in the fact that you're on the winning side, that you have a refuge, and make sure you're always standing close to him. Here's your one way out of here. Pray that you'll think about this while we stand together and sing.